evening, everybody. I'm Kate Eason from the Lit and Phil, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's talk. It's my great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Sue Prideaux. Sue is a writer whose first biography, Edvard Munch, Behind the Screen, won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. It was while writing about Munch that Sue became increasingly fascinated by his friend August Strindberg. Strindberg, A Life, was published by Yale in March 2012. It was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction and won the Duff Cooper Prize. Her most recent work, I Am Dynamite, A Life of Friedrich Nietzsche, won the Hawthornden Prize, and she visited the Lit and Phil in late 2019 to talk about this subject. Of the book, one critic said, "This is what every biography should be like, engrossing, intelligent, moving, often downright funny, and filled with insights and sharply observed details from an extraordinary life." Well, I'm sure tonight's talk on Nietzsche and Dionysus is sure to be as engrossing and filled with insight as the book itself. Please welcome Sue Prideaux. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be with the Lit and Phil again. You have a very special place in my heart because with my first book, Edvard Munch, you were the very first people to invite me to talk, and you've supported my writing ever since. So thank you very much for that. Last time, as Kay says, I was talking to you about my biography of Nietzsche. And actually behind me, I've lined up some of the foreign editions of the book, which has been published in the most amazing number of languages. But this one, can you see this one? This one's my favorite. This is the Persian edition. And the Persian cover artist has done a sort of mock Van Gogh of Nietzsche, which I think is completely astonishing. I think it's astonishing to be published in Iran. Also, actually, I'm also in Iraq, and those brave publishers and brave journalists, I've given Zooms and newspaper interviews in both those countries. And I'm just shattered by the vital importance that they place on the life of the mind in their very difficult situations. But we're not going to talk about that tonight. We're going to delve a little deeper into Nietzsche and Dionysus, and that means the birth of tragedy. Nietzsche's first book, published in 1872, when he was 28 years old. It's acknowledged as a book of great importance in the history of thought, but for all that, it's not often or easily read. And luckily, I can't see your hands, or I might do a hands up. It's a young man's book. Like lots of first books, it's too deeply felt to be faultless, but actually I find it all the more lovable for that. And Nietzsche was pretty modest and uncertain of himself when he wrote it. And the book opens with a preface headed, "An Attempt at Self-Criticism." I'll read you a bit. There we are. An attempt at self-criticism. Whatever underlies this questionable book, it must be a most stimulating and supremely important question, and furthermore, a profoundly personal one, as is attested by the times in which it was written, and in spite of which it was written. The turbulent period of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. While the thunder of the Battle of Worth rolled across Europe, the brooder and lover of riddles who fathered this book was sitting in some corner of the Alps, utterly preoccupied with his ponderings and riddles, and consequently very troubled and untroubled at one and the same time, writing down his thoughts about the Greeks, the core of this odd and rather inaccessible book, to which this late preface is to be dedicated. A few weeks later, he was himself beneath the walls of Metz and still obsessed with the question marks he had placed over the alleged cheerfulness of the Greeks, until finally, in that extremely tense month, when peace was being discussed at Versailles, he too made peace with himself and whilst recovering slowly from an illness which he had brought back from the field, reached a settled and definitive view in his own mind. The finest, most envied race of men ever known, the people who made life seem most seductive, the Greeks. Why did they, of all people, need tragedy or even art? What purpose was served by Greek art? So that's the big question he's asking. And in fact, when Nietzsche mentions the Franco-Prussian War and two of its great battles, Metz and Worth, he's underselling himself. Nietzsche hated war. In his opinion, the mass killing of young men was a stupid way to settle differences. But because he was working at a Swiss university at the time, he didn't actually have to fight in the Franco-Prussian War, but he felt it was cowardly to opt out of action altogether. So he volunteered as a medical orderly. The battles he mentions, Metz and Worth, he was there on the battlefield, tending to the wounded and dying, and he nursed them on the hospital trains, taking the wounded to nearby hospitals. And somewhere along the line, probably on one of the trains, he contracted both diphtheria and dysentery simultaneously, obviously from one of his patients. It was touch and go. He didn't die, he recovered, but his health was never the same for the rest of his life. So that's him when he's writing it. And I'll give you a quick outline of the text of The Birth of Tragedy. It falls roughly into three parts. The first describes the origin of tragedy in ancient Greece as the outcome of a struggle between two forces within the human spirit, which he names as the Apollonian, named after the Greek sun god Apollo, standing for the joys of beauty, order, reason, clarity of form, control, the Enlightenment values, if you like. You or me sitting down in a library and getting to grips with the joys of a knotty intellectual problem. And the Dionysian, named after the god of wine, intoxication, transgression, emotion, irrationality, ecstasy, impulse, the destruction of individuality and group joy, excess, Bacchic, orgiastic stuff. You and me at Glastonbury or at a football match. But if you don't do either of those, and I'm afraid I don't, I'm sure you can think of some other occasion when you lose yourself in ecstasy. The second part of the book is concerned with the lack of balance introduced into later literature. And when I say later Greek literature, we're talking very early days indeed. Ancient Greece as opposed to archaic Greece. Nietzsche's criticizing Socrates for privileging theoretical knowledge over human experience, intellect over instinct, the Apollonian qualities over the Dionysian. The task, as Nietzsche sees it, is to get these two opposed impulses in harmony with each other again. And this is what the third part of the book deals with. And the third part is a manifesto, how we can get back to the balance achieved by the archaic Greeks. The balance between the two forces, getting the two warring impulses to work creatively together within the individual and within the body of culture. So what impelled Nietzsche to write such a book? Where did it come from? Before his experience that he describes during the Franco-Prussian War, he'd actually been thinking about two things for about 10 years. One, the duality of man's nature. Two, how man copes with the essential tragedy of the human condition. We arrive on this earth, we lead a short life. What's the meaning of the whole thing? He'd been thinking about these things at least since he was 15 years old, when the world changed radically, with Darwin publishing his theory of evolution. It spread like wildfire, and the world saw flight from belief in religion to belief in science. a world with meaning and purpose guided by God, who no longer seemed all-powerful, didn't really seem that credible anymore. But people liked stability and purpose. And for a time, it looked as if science was going to provide the structural stability previously provided by religion. Belief in the immutability of God and God-given laws was being transferred into belief in the immutability of scientific laws. Whoops, I'm sorry, the setting sun is putting a spotlight on me, but I can still see to read. Nietzsche was quick to see two problems. One, science does not supply existential meaning. Two, today's scientific law is not eternal truth with a big T. A new discovery comes along, and tomorrow there's a new truth. Think of Stephen Hawking, revising his ideas of multiverses shortly before his death. And astrophysics today is apparently questioning Newton's theory of gravity. That's not my area of expertise, but I do read about it and try to keep up. So Nietzsche was right about science. Time has proved that. Science is about questioning and progress. It's not about establishing a steady structure of eternal, immutable truths. And it's certainly not about moral truths. Science takes no moral stance. And Nietzsche had been pondering these things ever since he was a schoolboy. Then in 1869, he was appointed professor of philology at Basel University. By now, he was 24. But still, he was the youngest professor they'd ever appointed, and the most unqualified. He hadn't even finished his PhD, but he was a whiz at classical philology, the science of the classical languages and linguistics, a thoroughly nitpicking discipline of burrowing into details, requiring reason, iron discipline, and method. And he hated it. What he really wanted was to be appointed to the chair of philosophy, but he didn't have the requisite degree in philosophy. Besides, that chair wasn't empty. What Nietzsche longed to do was to mind the compelling problems of life, rather than spend his time investigating the grammatical minutiae of ancient Greek and Roman texts. Nietzsche always has a wonderful way with words, and he describes his fellow philologists as a seething brood of moles with baggy cheeks and blind eyes, burrowing in the dark, underground, overjoyed when they capture a worm, and completely indifferent to the true problems of life. Into this blind, boring, burrowing life dedicated to detail erupted the music of Richard Wagner. Nietzsche writes about it in orgasmic terms, the sweet, shuddering infinity of it. Every fiber, every nerve in my body quivered. Who can listen without expiring in a spasmodic unharnessing of all the wings of the soul? How can anyone fail to be shattered immediately? Dionysus had gate-crashed his Apollonian life. The dry scholar had been overtaken by a force of nature, uncontrollable pleasure. He met Wagner, and it was one of those instant friendships, a meeting of minds and imaginations that feed off each other, building castles in the air that goes up and up and up. Over the next few years, Nietzsche stayed 23 times at Tribschen, Wagner's lovely house on Lake Lucerne. Wagner gave Nietzsche his own room there. The only other person to be given his own room was King Ludwig of Bavaria, Mad King Ludwig, who built all those castles, and who felt just as strongly as Nietzsche about Wagner's music. The king was putting up the money for Wagner to live on while he finished writing the cycle of 4 operas that comprise the Ring cycle. And this is the background against which Nietzsche thought up and wrote The Birth of Tragedy. It was an extraordinary place, and I thought I'd read you a bit about it from my book. Incidentally, the long title of it is The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. And of course, Wagner's music has a great bearing on that title, really, as you'll see. Tription. Many visitors commented that they found Tription too pink and over-endowed with cupids. But such an interior was something quite new and intoxicating to Nietzsche, whose life had been spent in self-denying Protestant rooms. Tription's walls were covered in red and gold damask, or in cordovan leather, or in a special shade of violet velvet that had been carefully chosen to set off to best advantage the dazzling white marble busts of Wagner and King Ludwig. There was a carpet made of breast feathers of flamingos, bordered with peacock's feathers. Exalted high on a plinth stood a ridiculously fragile, elaborately curlicued beaker of ruby Bohemian glass, presented to Wagner by the king. Mementos of glory were hung like hunting trophies on the walls. Fading laurel wreaths, autograph programs, paintings of a muscle-bound, golden-haired Siegfried getting the better of the dragon, breast-plated Valkyries storming the skies like thunderclouds, and Brunhilde bursting with joy as she awakened on her rock. Bibelots and precious objects lay trapped behind glass in vitrines like pinned butterflies. Windows were muted by drifts of pink gauze and shimmering satin. The perfume of roses, tuberoses, narcissi, lilacs, and lilies hung heavy on the air. The creation of Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, integrating drama, music, and spectacle, was itself a Gesamtkunstwerk, involving Wagner's every physical sense. For as he saw it, if I am obliged once more to plunge into the waves of an artist's imagination in order to find satisfaction in an imaginary world, I must at least help out my imagination and find means of encouraging my imaginative faculties. I cannot then live like a dog. I cannot sleep on straw and drink common gin. Mine is an immensely irritable, acute, and hugely voracious, yet uncommonly tender and delicate sensuality, which one way or another must be flattered if I am to accomplish the cruelly difficult task of creating in my mind a non-existent world. The room from whose window Nietzsche had heard the Siegfried chord floating was the Green Room, Wagner's composition room, a surprisingly small, masculine, and workmanlike space within Tription's heavily operatic atmosphere. Two walls covered in bookshelves reminded one that Wagner was as much a man of words as of music, who composed as many books, pamphlets, and libretti as musical works. The piano was specially designed with drawers for pens, and a table-like plane on which the sheets of the latest composition could be flung while the ink was drying on the paper. Visitors madly covered these sheets, and Wagner knew the value of autographing them and giving them out to the favored influential. Over the piano hung the large portrait of the king. For some reason in Tription it was bad form to refer to King Ludwig by name. He was the royal friend. He visited Tription alone and incognito, even spending the night, after which his bedroom was kept ever ready for his return. Tription was Ludwig's Rambouillet, his Marie Antoinette dairy. It took on much the same role for Nietzsche. He was the only person, apart from the king, to be given his own room. And during the course of the next 3 years, he would visit Tription 23 times, and it would live in his thought forever as the island of the blessed. King Ludwig, who was paying the bills, had given Wagner carte blanche to settle wherever his imagination might be free of all practical considerations, as he concentrated solely on finishing the ring cycle, which was the king's passion. Wagner had settled on this spectacularly picturesque site that took full advantage of Kant's principle of the sublime, a function of the extreme tension experienced by the mind in apprehending immensity and boundlessness, transcending every standard of sense, and which rouses a sort of delightful horror, a sort of tranquility tinged with terror, which, accomplished through a transcendent scale of reference, a greatness comparable to itself alone, its effect is to throw the mind back upon itself, and thus we soon perceive that the sublime is not to be looked for in the things of nature, but in our own ideas. On this principle, the transcendent views from Krippen's Every Window might trigger sublime inspiration in both Wagner and Nietzsche, wherever they looked. Through the west-facing windows, where the sun set, rose the eternal snows of Mont Pilatus, originally a pre-Christian Nibelheim of legendary dragons and hobgoblins, renamed in a later Christian era for Pontius Pilate, who, banished from Galilee after the crucifixion of Christ, fled to Lucerne. Here, overcome by remorse, he climbed the 7,000-foot peak of the Pilatus, from which he flung himself into the little ink-black tarn that you can see below. Here lives his ghost, in silence and stillness complete. Local guides will tell you that the water itself is dead, pointing out as proof that its surface is always motionless and quite incapable of being ruffled by even the highest wind. Black pines surround the cursed spot. For centuries, no woodcutter dared venture there for fear of provoking the spirit to whom so many calamities were attributed. And so the pine trees grew up in tall peaks, pressing round the little water, and, incidentally, keeping the wind out and the water unruffled. In the 14th century, a brave priest waded into Pilate's dark suicide lake and performed an exorcism. Nevertheless, the locals remained wary, and the numerous thunderstorms that bang and clatter round the mountain and swirl sudden storms on Lake Lucerne remained attributed to Pilate's ghost. It was only after the 1780s that the frühe Romantiker, pale young men with their minds in paroxysms of poetic metaphor, who valued Kantian sublimity and poetry of the heart above all else, ventured onto the ill-omened mountain, where Pilate's pool surely made the ultimate suicide spot for many a young Werther hopelessly crossed in love. By the time Wagner was inviting Nietzsche to join him on refreshing all-day hikes up the Pilatus, enterprising peasants had constructed a hostelry and were hiring out ponies for the ascent. Wagner and Nietzsche scorned this service. They conquered the rocky crags on foot, singing and philosophizing all the way up. Should Nietzsche look through Krippen's lake-facing windows, his eyes would sweep down the Robbers' Park, a grassy, bouldery headland grazed by Wagner's horse Fritz, his chickens, peacocks, and sheep, who dotted the ground sloping down to the lake's edge. Wagner and Nietzsche were both fond of swimming from the bathing ladder that cut the pale reflections of the run of snowy mountains on the far shore of the lake. The Rigi, at 6,000 foot, is a little lower than the Pilatus, but just as famous for being painted by J.M.W. Turner and for the curious lighting effect known as the Rigi ghost. In particular conditions, requiring brightness and mist, you can see the ghost clearly. It takes the shape of an enormous human figure, like the silhouette of a giant in the vaporous sky above you. The giant is surrounded by a rainbow nimbus. In fact, it's no ghost, but your own figure projected onto the mist, as you discover when you stretch your arms out in wonder, upon which you see your movements gigantically reflected in the mist as in a magnifying mirror. Wagner used to dance and cut capers at his heavenly mirror image until the mist moved and the puppet show was gone. On the lake's edge to the right of Wagner's bathing ladder was a little chalet, roofed with wooden shingles, housing a boat. When Wagner needed to let off steam, he'd get his faithful servant, Jacob, to row him out through the flocks of white Lohengrin swans that sailed on the lake, far out to the echo spot where William Tell taunted his evil adversary, Landvogt Gessler, by shouting insults that rang round the mountains in endless mockery. Wagner liked to bellow obscenities in his rough Saxon accent. It made him roar with laughter when the echoes shouted back to him. So that's Tribschen, and that was what was going on when he was thinking about the birth of tragedy and discussing it with Wagner. Actually, you can go there today. They give concerts on Wagner's piano. It was a very unconventional domestic setup. Wagner was living there with Cosima, the daughter of the composer Franz Liszt. And Liszt, like Wagner, was another European superstar. He was very handsome. He traveled the world giving concerts, and women swooned. And Nietzsche, the modest son of a modest priest, found himself suddenly rocketed into dizzying circles, socially, artistically, and intellectually. Cosima was actually married to the conductor Hans von Bülow at the time, but she was heavily pregnant with Wagner's child. So Nietzsche had stepped right into a household that was self-consciously balancing the Dionysian with the Apollonian, one feeding off another in a sustained high level of sexual and intellectual activity. Now I say self-consciously because on the walls of Tribschen hung a picture painted by Ginelli called Dionysus sporting with the Apollonian muses. Wagner, who was incapable of seeing himself in anything but mythical terms, interpreted the triangular relationship between himself, Cosima, and her husband von Bülow as the love triangle between Dionysus, who being a god was Wagner, Ariadne, Cosima, and von Bülow, who took the role of Theseus, a mere man. You'll remember the legend. Ariadne in Greek mythology was the daughter of Pasiphae and the Cretan king Minos. She fell in love with the Athenian hero Theseus, and with a thread or a trail of glittering jewels, helped him escape the labyrinth after he slew the Minotaur, a beast half bull, half man, that Minos kept in the labyrinth, feeding him human sacrifice. Theseus promised to marry Ariadne, but he abandoned her on the island of Naxos, where she was ravished by the god Dionysus. During his many visits to Tribschen, Nietzsche, as well as falling in love with Wagner's music, was also falling ever more in love with Wagner's Ariadne, Cosima. Wagner was coming to the end of composing The Ring. It had taken him 20 years, and it was a completely new form of artwork. And with it, Wagner proposed to revive German art, to rescue German culture from the Philistinism, mediocrity, and materialism of Bismarck's Reich. Nietzsche and Wagner both felt that culture, hijacked by church and state, had lost its way, lost its mystery, its true life-affirming purpose, and fallen into what they called unproductive pessimism, nihilism, and deadening institutionalism. German culture was migrating from the higher, the spiritual values, to the lower, as it was sidelined by the capitalism associated with industrialization. We are losing the center of gravity that allows us to live. We are lost. It seems as if there is no meaning in existence, as though everything were in vain. And this nihilism and state of sterility of late 19th century culture, we see it quite a bit in Victorian Britain too, was what Nietzsche was addressing in The Birth of Tragedy, a book that was fed by the conversations between Nietzsche and Wagner during their years together at Princeton. For those of you who haven't read The Birth of Tragedy lately, I'm going to fill out the outline I gave you earlier. But first, you must know that Nietzsche insists that all philosophy is autobiographical. I'll repeat that. All philosophy is autobiographical. He insists that philosophical conclusions can only be drawn from experience. And that's why I've given you all this long preamble about the circumstances leading up to the writing of the book. So The Birth of Tragedy is a young man's impassioned attack on the cultural degeneration of his day, also a manifesto for the cultural regeneration through the vision of Richard Wagner, who he casts as the new Aeschylus, forging a revival of the tragic spirit of the archaic Greeks. But from the particular comes the general, and the book endures as something far greater than that. It asks, what is human culture? It examines the vital interactions between life and art, between the rational and the instinctive, between the world of culture and human response to it. And of course, being a classical philologist, Nietzsche went right back to the earliest relics of our European culture, the remaining fragments of the plays of 5th century Greece, to think about how the Greeks dealt with the eternal existential problem and how they were dealt with in his own day. The Greeks, Nietzsche argued, used art to deal with what he calls the wound of existence, the common predicament, the existential horror, the abyss that mankind has never ceased to confront, the fear of death and the fear of the meaninglessness of life. The Greeks, he argued, used arts as a safety valve that enabled them to act without being inhibited by the terror of existence. The Birth of Tragedy famously opens by telling us that just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes, so the continuing development of art and culture down the ages depends on the interplay of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Like the two sexes, they're engaged in a continual struggle, interrupted only occasionally by temporary periods of reconciliation. The arts belonging to Dionysus are music and tragedy. Dionysus, the son of Zeus, was perceived in ancient Greece as both man and animal. He represented an enchanted world of extraordinary experience, transcending existential boundaries. The god of wine and intoxication, of drink and drugs, of ritual madness and ecstasy. God of the fictional world of the theatre, of the mask, of impersonation and illusion. He's the god whose arts subvert the normal or individual identity of his followers as they're transformed by them. The Dionysian is affirmation of the world as it is, affirmation of our animal selves. It doesn't deny the thicket of chaos we exist in. It acknowledges and reflects the savagery within us. At the same time, it salves that wound by taking us out of ourselves, erasing individuality. So sex and drugs and rock and roll belong. They're a reinterpretation, if you like, of the oldest festal joys of mankind, the Dionysian mysteries. It's not a moral force. Nietzsche stresses the importance of this. It's quite simply a creative force, attracting and repelling the primeval energy that he would later call the will to power. If we think of the Dionysian in terms of time, it embraces the uncertainty of transitoriness, what he calls the enjoyment of productive and destructive forces as continual creation. In Greek tragedy, the Dionysian was held in balance with the Apollonian. He identifies the Apollonian with the plastic arts, particularly sculpture, painting, architecture, and dreams. The Apollonian qualities are the civilizing qualities, harmony, the eternity of beautiful form, lucidity, controlled creativity, the academic, the comforts of the intellect, the idea of permanence, eternal laws bequeathing the lovely reassurance of stability. The world of Apollo is made up of rational individuals whose gesture and gaze speak to us of the intense pleasure of wisdom, of boundaries, of the desire for order, the desire to make everything strong, clear, unambiguous, what Nietzsche calls the beauty of semblance. But we can't talk about Greek theatre and ignore the chorus. Nietzsche proposes that the chorus is a representation of the Dionysian state. And this is contrary to what we're accustomed to think today, that the chorus is a sort of individual commentator, the voice of every man. But Nietzsche says that the chorus is not every man, it's the communal, offering metaphysical consolation by erasing the individual. Greek tragedy had originated in a festival in honor of Dionysus, but had died out in this form by the end of the 5th century BC for no apparent reason. And Nietzsche blames Socrates. He blames the Socratic maxims, that virtue is knowledge, that all sin arises from ignorance, and that the happy man is the virtuous man. In these three basic formulae lie the death of tragedy. A new principle has entered Greek theatre. And after Socrates, people are held fast by the delusion that pleasure in understanding can heal the wound of existence. But this is to ignore that the world is more than a replica of phenomena. To ignore the Dionysian is to remain incomplete. And so in Nietzsche's own day, which he calls this period of late Socratic culture, a period that by implication goes on to include our day as well, man remains eternally hungry, eternally unsatisfied. In the negotiation between the two forces, the Dionysian has been completely overcome. Man as animal has been negated and suppressed, reduced to rationality. Nietzsche describes modern man as basically an editor, a proofreader, sacrificing his sight miserably to book dust and printing error, a statement that recalls his description of his fellow philologists as blind moles burrowing in the dark for worms, while ignoring the real problems of life. It's not my opinion, by the way. I'm keen on both proofreaders and philologists, but that's by the by. The book goes on to address the problem of science. Science was a post-Socratic problem in Greece, and it remains a post-Darwinian problem in Europe. By faith in the explicability of nature and knowledge as a panacea, science annihilates myth. As you can imagine, Nietzsche sees this as a great mistake. The Greeks could connect all their experiences to their myths. Myth was the architecture within experience was formed. Music was the Dionysian, words the Apollonian. And in the early tragedies, they were held in perfect balance, as Wagner will do again. As a result of suppressing the Dionysian and annihilating myth, we have fallen into what Nietzsche calls a sterile, unproductive mode of existence. All artwork must become what it once was. The balance must be restored. And this is where the book basically turns into a hymn to Wagner, an extended fan letter. Ooh, I'm going to overrun a bit, but not by much. Sorry about that. Wagner's operas, with their marriage of words and music, present the new tragic art form in which the Dionysian and the Apollonian are reunited. Wagner is the new Aeschylus, forging a revival of the tragic spirit that will rescue European culture from materialism, over-intellectual stagnancy, and mediocrity. Wagner revives the tragic myth, Nordic rather than Greek, but that doesn't matter. The Nordic gods behave badly, just as badly as the gods of ancient Greece. Virtue is not one of their virtues. They demonstrate the old heroic qualities that had been squashed by the Christian church: strength, valor, cunning. The mortals in Wagner's opera are Greek heroes in German dress, cheerful warriors, victorious, destructive, celebrating the Dionysian principle that the urge to destroy is also a... You'll recognize that quote from Bakunin, and I brought it in here because Wagner fought shoulder to shoulder with Bakunin in 1849 in the Dresden Uprising, for which Wagner both provided the money to buy the hand grenades and the muscle power to throw them at the government troops who were suppressing a democratic movement. This might surprise you. Today, Wagner's perceived as a right-winger, but that's hindsight. To really understand Wagner and the effect he had on his time and on Nietzsche, you must remember that Wagner was a revolutionary, a rule breaker, domestically, politically, intellectually, as well as a rule breaker in music. Revolutionary in dissonance. Wagner's use of musical dissonance reflects and acknowledges the dissonance of man's soul and the tension within it between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The final bit of The Birth of Tragedy uses quotations from Wagner's libretti to demonstrate that Wagner uses the Dionysian in conjunction with the Apollonian. This, Nietzsche says, has always been the highest goal of tragedy and of all art. Wagner once more gives room to the Dionysian man with the primeval impulses that are part of making him human, however licentious, cruel, or immoral parts of him are. They help him deal with himself, as well as with this terrible, multifarious, uncertain, frightful world, enabling the spirit amidst chaos and hardship, acknowledging the disorderly abyss that rationality alone can neither explain nor justify. The book was a terrible failure. By using the Dionysian to refract the disturbing realities within us, Nietzsche had offended the very, very Apollonian spirit of the German Reich. 1870s Germany was not the place to celebrate the irrational. And when Nietzsche returned to Basel University next term to teach, he found that only 2 students had enrolled for his course of lectures. And one was an upholsterer who had obviously signed on for the wrong course. Published in 1872, the book got 1 annihilatingly bad review and sold only about 600 copies. It languished in obscurity for 28 years, until 1900, the year Nietzsche died, and the same year Freud published his first book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Suddenly Nietzsche's preoccupation with myth, with the irrational, dreams, transgressive, and the sexual drive was of enormous interest. But despite the failure of Nietzsche's book in his lifetime, it was not an idea he was to relinquish. The concept of human nature's duality, the importance of finding the balance, and the crucial need to confront the illusion of certainty provided by science would occupy his thoughts for the rest of his active life. Nietzsche never lost sight of the figure of Dionysus in his writing. As his thought progressed, Dionysus morphed into the will to power, and Nietzsche took on the identity of Dionysus as an alter ego. Remaining in love with Cosima Wagner, she now became his Ariadne, but only in his fantasy. Cosima harbored no erotic thoughts towards him at all. Nietzsche called one of his volumes of poetry the dithyrambs of Dionysus. You might not know that Nietzsche actually wrote quite a lot of poetry. Some of it was good, some of it was not so good. A dithyramb is, as you know, a Greek choric hymn to Dionysus. And I'm going to read you just a very little from the beginning of quite a long one called Ariadne's Complaint. It's one of his last poems, written in 1888. And I find it very powerful and actually quite shocking. I want to read it to you because I think it shows a side of Nietzsche that not many people know. It may surprise you. He writes it in Ariadne's voice, and this is when Ariadne is on Naxos, and Theseus has abandoned her, and the god Dionysus comes to her. Spread-eagled, shuddering, like one half dead whose feet are warmed, shaken alas by unknown fevers, trembling with sharp, icy frost arrows, pursued by you, my thought, unutterable, veiled, terrible one, huntsman behind the clouds, struck down by your lightning bolt, your mocking eye that stares at me from the darkness. Thus I lie, bend myself, twist myself, tortured by every eternal torment, smitten by you, cruel huntsman, you, unknown God. Strike deeper, strike once again, sting and sting, shatter this heart. What means this torment with blunt arrows? Why do you look down, unwearied of human pain, with malicious, divine, flashing eyes? Will you not kill? Only torment, torment? Why torment me, you malicious, unknown God? One of the very last letters Nietzsche wrote in his short life, some 25 years after, was addressed to Cosima, and it simply said, Ariadne, I love you. He signed it, Dionysus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you so much from on behalf of the audience and on behalf of the Lytton Phil. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Sue?
Hello, it's another Sue here. I wonder if I can ask you, I don't know very much about Nietzsche, I'll hold my hand up to that, but obviously there's a connection made between Hitler hijacking some of his ideas and certainly things that I was taught about many years ago. Would you agree with that, or is that a modern myth?
How long have you got? Hi, Sue. Hello. Thanks for asking that question. I have a very short time to give you rather a complicated answer. Okay, so their lives didn't overlap. Nietzsche died before Hitler was born. Okay, and Nietzsche died in 1900. But before that, he had been insane for 11 years, okay? So you get a period. Nietzsche's sister, when he goes insane in 1888, takes Nietzsche under her wing and she appropriates all his writings, okay? Now she's called Elizabeth, and Elizabeth doesn't die until 1935. Now, Nietzsche and Elizabeth didn't get on terribly well because Nietzsche hated Bismarck's Germany, which was nationalist, racist, and anti-Semitic. And he wrote against all those things. He said, I'm Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. That is the end of German philosophy. He said, I call myself a good European. I refuse this nationalism. And he was pro-Semitic rather than anti-Semitic. Okay, Elizabeth is basically a proto-Nazi, and she hijacked his writing from 1888 until 1835. And so she's a Nazi really before the Nazis sort of happen. But when Hitler comes along, he and she become bosom friends. And she has got the Nietzsche archives, all his writings, and she forges a book called The Will to Power. She does a cut and paste job on his writings, and she publishes this under Nietzsche's name. And basically, she skews his philosophy for Nietzsche and for Mussolini, both of whom absolutely adore her. Hitler actually goes to her funeral. He calls her one of the mothers of Germany. So it was really only in the 1950s and late 1960s that this whole that really proper scholars, there were some marvelous scholars, there were about 6 of them internationally, got into the Nietzsche archive and unmuddled what Nietzsche had written and what Elizabeth had forged and what Hitler's other propagandists had written in Nietzsche's name. So does that answer you a bit? I've rushed through it.
It does, yes. I've read a little bit around that. Yeah, I think that because I suppose I didn't come into it in the 1960s, and therefore sort of inherited that supposition that Nietzsche, Hitler, Mussolini, anti-Semitism, Wagner, they all come together. Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, things like, well, say the blonde beast. Okay, the blonde beast is a phrase that that Nietzsche coined in the genealogy of morality. And what in the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche was saying, okay, before Judeo-Christianity came along, before any gods came along, what was morality? What is morality founded on? And so then he imagines when the blonde beast crawled out of the swamp and first stood on 2 legs, what was his morality? And Nietzsche describes the blonde beast, i.e. early man specifically. He is Japanese, he's an Arab, he's a Viking, he's a European. So Nietzsche is just using an image that to pop into your mind. Here's this wild creature, rather like a lion, actually, the first man crawling out of the swamp. Okay, where does he find his morality? Okay, so Hitler and his propagandists, the blonde beast, great. This is the German race, you know, this is us, and the blonde beast will conquer the world. So that's typical of what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Sue, if there's time, there's a question from Richard Simpson. He says, first of all, brilliant talk, but he then goes on to say, can Sue say anything about Nietzsche's falling out with Wagner and the impact, if any, of that event on his later views about Dionysus?
Well, falling out with Wagner, there were various reasons for that, really. One was actually as early as the Franco-Prussian War, which was when he was falling in love with Wagner, but he was always also falling out with him because of Wagner's anti-Semitism, nationalism, and absolute glorification of war. And Nietzsche was desperately upset at the siege of Paris when the Prussians besieged Paris. And it was the most awful, cruel siege. And Nietzsche, as I said, really hated all this sort of thing. And Wagner glorified the Prussians going into Paris. And at that time, Wagner was so excited about the whole thing. He refused to open any letters written to him in French. He refused to speak French. It was just Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. So there is the Nietzsche's growing anti-nationalism and Wagner's growing nationalism. So that politically was quite difficult. And then there was also a terrible thing, which was that, as I told you, Nietzsche was ill after the Franco-Prussian War, and he'd been ill before it too. He had inherited some sort of condition from his father, who died insane, aged 36. Nietzsche also goes insane, but a little later in his life. So Nietzsche was ill all his life, and he had these appalling periods that when he couldn't see anything, he went blind, he just had to stay in bed, terrible headaches. And so Wagner got in touch with his doctor, Wagner's own doctor. He said, Nietzsche, you know, hey, my doctor can really help you. Go and see him. So Wagner gets in touch with his doctor. He says, I'm sending you my friend Nietzsche, and I think he's got syphilis, actually. And I think he's got syphilis because he's gay. He doesn't really have, you know, he's in love with Cosima. He doesn't really have any sort of women's problem. And so Nietzsche goes to Wagner's doctor, who actually examines him for a couple of days and doesn't discover syphilis, and doesn't really get to the bottom of it, puts him on the most awful diets. Can you imagine being on an all meat diet? All you're allowed to eat 6 times a day is meat. No wonder the poor man was ill. But anyway, eventually, a little later, Nietzsche discovers this letter that Wagner has written to his doctor saying that he thinks that Nietzsche's gay. And of course, those days are very different from these days. And Nietzsche was mortally insulted by this, mortally insulted. This was a slur on his, you know, on his reputation. And well, they grew apart in many ways, although partly I think Nietzsche tremendously resented the absolutely magic spell that Wagner's music put him under. He was helpless when it was played, and that was almost too much to bear. And he did actually, I think he always loved him, and in the end, he was thinking about him. So love, hate, you know, happens to us all, doesn't it? The people we love most can be difficult. Thank you for the question, Richard.
A comment from another Susan. Thank you to Sue for this clear and interesting talk. I learned an enormous amount, and I'm thinking about how relevant it is to post-Brexit Britain. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, Sue.
I'm not quite sure what is relevant to post-Brexit Britain. I'm not quite with that question. I mean,
I just wonder if Johnson is a little bit Dionysian at all, and we've lost rationality somewhere. There's an imbalance, isn't there?
I understand. Perhaps. Oh, no, I understand completely. Perhaps. What you're saying.
I might be wrong.
No. I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's no harm in having a Dionysian prime minister, as long as you've got some jolly good Apollonian around him. I think you're right, Susan. I think it's in my opinion. It's out of balance. But I mean, you know, luckily we do have a democracy, we do have checks and balances, you know, nil desperandum, really. On we go. And I guess it's now after 7 o'clock, so I guess I've overstayed my welcome. But thank you so much, and great questions. Thanks a lot. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Sue, and I hope that we can welcome you back in the Lytton Phil building itself before too long.
Bless you.
Your talk's fantastic, much appreciated, and as I say, hope to see you very soon. Thank you,
Me too.
everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.